To break through the Belgian lines behind the river the Meuse, the German forces had to take the fortress of Eben Emael. Their plan was to land airborne units on top of the fortress. These units would then dismantle the cannons and hold all its exits at gunpoint. They would later be reinforced by the 4th Armored Division. These reinforcements would have to cross the river the Meuse to reach the fort. The most ideal river crossings were a few kilometers to the north in the city of Maastricht. It was essential that the 3 bridges of Maastricht were taken unharmed. It's the morning of the 10th of May, 1940. In the small town of Maastricht hangs an ominous atmosphere. The Dutch army has been mobilized and there are guard posts stationed in an arc around the city. Some more are posted near the bridges. They are to blow them up at any sighting of enemy forces. At around 3:45 at the bridgehead north of Maastricht at Borgharen, a group of motorcyclists doomed up out of the mist. The Dutch forces recognized that they were German and took them under fire. This completely cut off the passage along the canal, and the German forces took refuge in the woods. After the Germans had recovered from the shock, they received reinforcements and began to exert heavy pressure. After several attacks and heavy losses, the Germans retreated and moved south. They had not taken the bridge. The remaining Dutch guards that were stationed on the eastern bank of the Meuse were taken out. This had created a breach in the outer bridgehead, allowing the Germans to advance towards the bridges. Around 5 o'clock, German armored cars, disguised as Dutch, arrived at Marienwaard. This disguise allowed them to take it without firing a shot. This blunder had fatal consequences for the rest of the outer bridgehead, since there was nobody standing between them and the station. They moved south and took it. They now occupied most of the district, and thus closed off any retreat for most of the remaining troops in the outer bridgehead. The section at the Goyselt, without knowing the full strength of the enemy, moved to the station for a counterattack. Without any anti-armor guns, they had no choice but to surrender. The section at Scharn heard about the breakthrough at Marienwaard and the presence of German troops near the station and the railroad crossing. They called the command post in Maastricht. The major, not yet well informed of the exact strength of the enemy, gave the order to regroup with the section at the Berg and then counterattack and retake the station and the railway crossing. When the numerous tanks were spotted, they saw the hopelessness of a counterattack, and after a small skirmish, they also withdrew. The section in here decided to retreat south and try to cross the river Meuse. The Scharn detachment had the same plans, but was too late. Near the railroad crossings east of Huygen, tanks from the 4th Armored Division surrounded them, and they surrendered. At 5:45, the 4th Armored Division threatened the outer bridgehead at Huygen. When they approached, orders were given to the remaining soldiers to retreat across the river. Since they had set up the roadblocks, the Germans were halted. This gave the Dutch time to reach the western bank by boat. The inner bridgehead consisted of multiple guards. At 5:15, all hell broke loose in the Akkerstraat. At guard number 2, armed with a heavy machine gun and 2 anti-tank rifles, the German panzers arrived. They had concentrated all of their forces on the Akkerstraat with the intention of advancing to the bridges after a rapid attack and cutting off passage for the remaining guards. Due to German overconfidence, the anti-tank rifles were able to knock out 3 of the German panzers before the heavy pressure from their counterattack forced the Dutch to retreat after a firefight of about 45 minutes. When they arrived at the Sint-Servaas Brug, it had already been blown up. They then reached the other bank of the Meuse with the help of some rowboats. Thanks to the persistent and prolonged resistance in the Akkerstraat, all other guard detachments could be withdrawn across the river. Finally, at 6:15, the Wilhelmina Bridge was also blown up. Only the railroad bridge still spanned the river. We remember that the Germans had broken through east of the canal at Borgharen, at which point they moved south. When the Dutch forces saw them racing towards the railway bridge, they opened fire from the other bank, with which they slowed down the German advance. When they did eventually arrive at the bridge, they climbed on top of it in an attempt to dismantle the explosives. It was then that the Dutch forces blew it up. They then withdrew to the zinc white factory. With the destruction of the railroad bridge at 6:20, the last river crossing was also lost to the German forces. The northern part of the 4th Armored Division now occupied Wick, The southern column was still waiting to clear the barriers on the Heugem Road. It was bombarded from the other bank by 2 light machine guns and 2 rifle groups. This made it difficult for the Germans to get out of their armored vehicles to blow up the barricade. It became even more difficult when later the torpedo men and pontoon men took their 5 heavy machine guns out of their boats and put them in position on the bank. They too strafed the column. Near the destroyed bridges, the Germans tried to cross the Meuse with rubber boats but quickly gave up. The heaviest fighting on the Meuse front took place near the railroad bridge. There, the German forces in the zinc-white factory were isolated by the Dutch fire. This situation did not last long because reinforcements came rolling in from the north and south. With most of the 4th Armored Division in Wick, they started taking the remaining defenders on the other bank under heavy fire. After heavy counter-pressure from the Germans, the Dutch resistance was almost exhausted. The heavy German fire made it impossible to hold out any longer. The Dutch staff met between 7 and 8 to discuss the situation. There was serious consideration as to how long it made sense to hold out. The goal: to slow down the enemy's advance, to report them, and to destroy the Meuse bridges was fulfilled. Continuation of the Meuse defense in view of the very weak own forces was not an option. Also, prolonged resistance would make the German artillery undoubtedly bring the city of Maastricht under heavy fire. The battle had to be stopped. Contact was made, and the German answer was brief. Orders were given to lay down arms and cease all resistance. The city of Maastricht was surrendered around 9:30. The battle was over. On May 11th at 11:20 a.m., Fort Eben Emael surrendered, more than 25 hours later than the Germans had calculated. Maastricht would be occupied by the Germans from the 10th of May 1940 until the 14th of September 1944. After 4 years of occupation, it would be one of the few places in the Netherlands that would be liberated by the American forces.